The city had not always been silent. For once its streets had thrummed with the chaotic rhythm of ordinary life, cars weaving between one another, shopkeepers shouting their wares, children laughing as they darted through the alleys. But when the first reports came in that shadows were no longer matching the figures they belonged to, a kind of unease settled over the population like a heavy smog, clinging and suffocating. Yet still they carried on, because what else could they do except pretend that life was unchanged? Even when the reflection in the glass pane of a bus shelter smiled a fraction too late, or a stranger's eyes lingered for far too long. Soon, military trucks began to appear, blocking off intersections with their canvas covers drawn tight to hide whatever they were carrying, while uniformed men spoke in hushed tones that suggested they themselves had no true answers. And rumors spread like a virus about a classified operation known only as Vanishing Point, a phrase whispered in stairwells and on rooftops by those who still dared to meet, a phrase that suggested not an attack, not a bomb, but an erasure, as if entire coordinates could be plucked from existence without even the courtesy of rubble left behind. The first true disappearance was not subtle. For one evening, an entire block of apartments, cafes, and neon-lit bars that had stood for decades was suddenly replaced by nothingness, not rubble, not ruins, not ash, but a polished surface like glass, stretching flat and infinite. And the few who witnessed it swore that in the instant before it happened, they had seen the sky ripple like disturbed water, then tear itself open to reveal a darkness so profound it felt alive. And afterward no one could even remember the names of those who had lived there, as if their biographies had been scrubbed clean from history itself. By the time the government declared martial law, it was already too late, because whole neighborhoods were blinking out like faulty bulbs, leaving only those who had the misfortune to survive. Survivors who claimed that sometimes the vanished were not entirely gone, because late at night one might see them standing at the edge of the glass expanse, faces blank, eyes hollow, mouths opening and closing without sound, as if trying to remember the act of speech itself. And in those moments it became clear that disappearance was not an end, but a transformation into something grotesque and unfit for human comprehension. No communication lines lasted more than a day, for satellites reported anomalies each time they attempted to scan the affected zones, their signals warping into strange frequencies filled with distorted whispers that linguists argued were not random at all, but fragments of language, deliberately rearranged into warnings we could not yet understand, though the soldiers sent into the void returned either. Catatonic eyes rolled white, or they did not return at all. Their last transmissions, describing streets that stretched endlessly in impossible loops where the architecture melted and reformed as though the city itself were dreaming us out of reality. Still, the operation continued, because governments cling to the illusion of control, even in the face of absolute chaos, and thus elite teams were dispatched to contain the perimeter, though the perimeters never held. For every time new barricades were built, they dissolved into the spreading emptiness within hours, and the soldiers themselves became unreliable witnesses. sometimes swearing that they had lived entire decades inside the vanished zones before waking up outside, unaged but trembling, with knowledge of futures that had not yet occurred, futures where the entire planet lay under the same glassy dome of unreality. The true horror was not the vanishing of structures or the bending of time, but the slow realization that memory itself was infected. For, as days passed, fewer people could recall the landmarks, the names, the birthdays of their loved ones who had been consumed. And when asked about them, the survivors would falter, their brows furrowed, until the memory collapsed into incoherence, as though the city was not merely being destroyed, but rewritten from the inside out, leaving only those too stubborn or too broken to forget entirely, trapped between loyalty to the ghosts of their past and the certainty that those ghosts had already become something alien. Entire caravans of refugees fled the outer districts, though they often disappeared, en route leaving abandoned cars along highways, where radios still crackled with strange chants that resembled voices speaking backward, yet, when played in reverse, revealed not salvation, but commands, urging the listener to surrender willingly, to let go of names, to step willingly into the erasure, because resistance was futile against an enemy that did not conquer with fire or weapons, but with silence, rewriting the very code of memory, until resistance itself seemed absurd, panned, and the line between choice and coercion dissolved. The scientists who remained argued bitterly over the cause, some insisting that this was a form of quantum collapse, triggered by alien interference, others proposing that humanity had been living inside a simulation all along, and that the erasures were merely the program deleting corrupted data, but all agreed on one point, that the phenomenon was spreading faster than containment could manage, and that the infection of thought was more dangerous than any physical loss. For once enough people forgot a place existed, it ceased to exist in every measurable sense, as though reality itself were dependent on belief, and belief was crumbling like wet paper. At night, the city emitted sounds no human throat could produce, deep resonant vibrations that shook the bones, accompanied by flickers of light beneath the glass surfaces, lights that pulsed like neurons firing in the brain, and those who gazed too long fell into trances, repeating the same phrase in monotone, "We are the next city. We are the next city," until someone silenced them. Though silencing did not always work, for sometimes the words kept spilling out of their mouths even after their throats had been cut, as if the city itself were using their husks as speakers to broadcast its hunger. Children were the most sensitive, often waking from nightmares, screaming about being buried under layers of mirrors, or being forced to walk endlessly in streets that folded in on themselves. And their drawings, when examined by psychologists, revealed uncanny consistency black spires rising out of glass planes, colossal figures with limbs too long for proportion, and swirling skies that bent downward, as if the heavens themselves were being pulled into a drain. Yet, when asked, the children insisted they had not dreamed these things, but remembered them, and the line between memory, dream, and prophecy became meaningless in a city that devoured all three. In one final attempt to salvage something from the disaster, a convoy of armored vehicles carrying high-ranking officials and scientists entered the epicenter with the goal of detonating a warhead powerful enough to disrupt whatever force was at play. Yet the feed they broadcast ended not with an explosion, but with the sudden blackout of all signals, and days later vehicles were found parked neatly in rows upon the glass. Doors open, engines cold, with no trace of passengers except faint outlines of their bodies impressed into the reflective surface, as if they had lain down willingly and allowed themselves to be absorbed. By then the maps themselves had become unreliable, for every day the cartographers redrew boundaries only to watch them vanish by evening. And soon even digital records failed, screens displaying only static or looping images of the missing streets, while survivors could no longer agree on where they had lived, some swearing entire districts had never existed, others insisting they remembered them vividly. And as arguments multiplied, it became clear that truth was fragmenting, and the more we debated what was real, the less reality itself seemed to hold, until existence resembled a thread unraveling at both ends with nothing left to anchor it. And so Operation Vanishing Point reached its final, inevitable stage, where silence became the only law, for the few who resisted found themselves hunted not by soldiers or aliens, but by the void itself, a creeping horizon that consumed their footsteps, their breath, their names, until even the act of telling the story became impossible. And now only the narration remains, spoken from the last fragments of memory left behind, a warning carried like ash on the wind, whispering that cities do not simply disappear, they are devoured by something far greater, something that does not kill, but erases, leaving nothing behind but a silence that grows louder each night.